God, we stand before you in all of our complexity, in all of our particularity, in all of our concerns, our hopes, our fears, our judgments, our misunderstandings. Flawed people, yet people created by you. Bring us, God, to your table, to a place of understanding, to a place of communion, and let your words speak to us throughout endless age. These things I pray. Amen. Holidays in the King household meant gathering around my grandmother's table. Margaret Jewel Gordy King reigned supreme over her kitchen and her household, especially over the preparation of both the food and the atmosphere. Now, it's important to note, we ate every day in my grandmother's house. My grandmother was a cook par excellence. But usually eating every day in our house meant fixing a plate at the stove and eating on a stool at the counter. It was very casual. It's very simple, very just everyday, quotidian, if you will. But Thanksgiving and Christmas were an entirely different story. We pulled out the extra leaf in the dining room table from the basement. We brought out the starched white tablecloth and we put on the lace overlay. We brought out my grandparents' wedding china. And we brought out the gold flatware. Dinner on a regular Monday evening was meat and vegetables and a starch, but dinner on the holidays was roast turkey and honey baked ham. It was collard greens, it was macaroni and cheese, candied yams, cornbread dressing, cranberry sauce, my grandmother's homemade rolls. It was a production, it was an event. And if you haven't figured it out by now, this was not just dinner, it was communion. It was the intentional effort to create a shared experience around this table. Now understand, every time we gathered around the table at my grandmother's house, it was not all peaches and cream. If you've ever eaten dinner with your family, you know sometimes the table is where all the dirty stuff comes out from the day. It's where all the underlying tensions get worked out across the table, and yet there is something beautiful about this idea that the table gives us space to put things on it. Gives us space to work out our tensions, our disagreements, gives us space to be honest about the fact that being together does not always mean being alike or being of one mind. This holiday dinner at my grandmother's table was an invitation to participate in sacred space, to sit with the solemn reality that being together is a blessing and a privilege. It was an opportunity to slow down the pace of our everyday lives and to enter into a rhythm where sharing our meal together was more important than just getting full by yourself. The table was transformative, and it was not a carry-out table. It was dining in. It was reserved seating. It was sit down and stay a while because we are not in a rush. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is proof that not every table is created equal. The Corinthian church was so special, Paul had to write them twice. And I appreciate that he wrote them this letter, because so often when people talk about the early church, they turn to Acts chapter 2. The second chapter of Acts describes a devoted church, a group of people who shared their resources and broke bread together, who lived with one heart and one mind. But we tend to forget one key detail. This church was brand new. Folks were just getting to know each other. The Acts community was a church in the honeymoon stage. This was a church fresh off of Pentecost. They hadn't known each other long enough to really get on each other's nerves. The church in Corinth is a different story. In a different culture, in a different time. The saying goes, familiarity breeds contempt. If you've got family, you know exactly what I mean. Sometimes the people you know and love the very most are the ones who know how to get to the core of your discontent. Are the persons who know how to push your buttons worse than anyone else can. And they do it in part because they know you will still love and care for them anyway. Sometimes the people closest to you are the hardest ones to share a table with. Corinth is a church filled with contempt because they have gotten familiar with each other's bad habits. Corinth is a church trying to cope with the challenge of becoming a beloved community. Now, the Apostle Paul has a personal stake in this. He is the founder of this congregation, and what they do is a reflection of him, but more importantly, it's a reflection of their commitment to God. Corinth is a specific example of a general issue. The issue is the belief that being the church is just a matter of showing up. The big question is what happens when we're there? Because it's easy to go through the motions without ever recognizing their meaning. It is easy to perform the practices and habits of church without living out the commitment to beloved community. Now, Paul's criticism of the church in Corinth centers on the fact that what they do does not match up with what they claim. They claim to be a church, but what happens in the gathering of this church is something that greatly resembles what happens in the outside world. I'm having to pause and consider, what does it mean to be a church, to literally be the called out, the ecclesia? If we are not called away from the very structures and very ideas that have shaped our presence in the world. Now, I can't be too hard on Corinth because every institution composed of human beings is under the influence of the culture that is around it. We do not come to church as blank slates. We do not come as people who have not already been shaped and formed by opinions and views and concerns of our immediate world and our immediate context, which means by the time we come together, there might be a little friction. There might be a little bit of conflict. What might mean the world to you might not even be on my radar. And yet here we are at the same table, trying to figure out what it means to be together. If you keep reading Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he reminds us of what the Corinthians have forgotten: the depth and the meaning of the Lord's Supper. He recounts the story of Jesus inviting his disciples to break bread and inviting his friends into a beloved community. And the Christian church takes root around a shared table where people from different walks of life take a seat and share in the body and the blood, the life and the death and the eventual resurrection of Jesus the Christ. The Lord's Supper is an invitation to become transformed people who learn to bear one another's burdens, who come to believe that the table of God is a place where no one should leave hungry, where your status in the world does not dictate your status before God. The struggle of Corinth is the struggle of many churches, that what happens inside of them does not look much different from what happens anywhere else in the world. And if the church is not a model for transforming a way of life, it is only a reflection of the world around it. And whenever you bring people together around a table, there are different expectations and norms. We may have conflicting ideas about what constitutes proper table manners. And I get the feeling that the church in Corinth has a struggle with its table manners, because every single one of us has our way of doing things, but that can be a problem when we allow our ways to dictate what happens at the Lord's table. Dinner at my grandmother's table did not happen until she sat down. It did not happen until the prayer had been invoked by my grandfather. There were rules, there were expectations, there were customs that were particular to our space and to our time. And this is true for every single one of us. We come from places, we have come from tables where rules have been set and ordered by the contingencies of where we are, but those contingencies come into conflict when we come together. And yet the history of this Christian church is a story of people constantly trying and failing to agree on what it means to sit at the Lord's table. If you don't believe me, ask the Protestant reformers in the Catholic Church. Ask the Anglican Communion in the Episcopal Church. Ask the Calvinists and the Arminians. Ask the Stone Campbell movement. Ask the Churches of Christ and the Disciples of Christ and the UCCs. Ask the ELCA and the Missouri Synod. Ask the PCUSA and the PCA and the Cumberland Presbyterians. Ask the United Methodists and the AMEs. Ask the Primitive Baptists. and the full gospel Baptists and the missionary Baptists and the American Baptists and the Anabaptists. Ask the Kojics and the Apostolics. Ask the Foursquare Church and the non-denominational churches. We come from a history of splits and schisms and factions and disagreements. This is not an exception. This is the rule. It happened in Corinth, and it certainly happens today. Now, I'm going to tell you up front, I don't believe there is a single resolution, but I think there is a way towards reorientation. Because I think this passage in 1 Corinthians suggests that our biggest problems start at the table in our own house. I'm reminded of Dr. Martin Luther King popularizing this now familiar concept of beloved community. This is not a lofty fantasy or an idyllic goal. No, beloved community is a vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the world. It is a vision in which poverty and hunger and homelessness are not tolerated because human decency will not allow it. It's a vision in which the church does not determine value by who gives what kind of offering or who sits in the front pew versus the balcony or who comes in from the right kind of background. It is not a vision of a group without conflict, but of a community that faces conflict and seeks peaceful reconciliation. And also recognizes that sometimes reconciliation does not mean we come back together as one. Sometimes it means we peacefully agree to go our separate ways. The church becomes a beloved community when we are transformed by communion, when we accept that sometimes we just don't get along. And this is not to erase our differences. It is to say these differences are particular and unique and beautiful, and we must struggle and wrestle with them to understand one another, to love one another. The Corinthian church is a church that is bound up in a logic that contradicts beloved community precisely because it is the logic that teaches us to love a God we have not seen and to despise the people we see every day. It is a logic that teaches us it's okay for some people to be excommunicated and marginalized. It's the logic that teaches us it is okay to unconsciously reproduce the logic of our systems of oppression in the places of refuge. So what do? I'll leave you with this simple thought. We do not have the beloved communities we want. We have the beloved communities we choose to build. The church in Corinth was built with an idea, with a belief that beloved community was possible. I believe it still is. But it might happen more slowly than we think. Might happen with more difficulty, more weeping and gnashing of teeth. It might mean more disruptions, factions, disagreements. And still, we press on into beloved community.